Hey guys, welcome back. Or welcome if this is your first time here. Tonight, we're not starting with a person. We're starting with a feeling. That deep, bone-level chill that doesn't just whisper winter, but screams it for months on end. We're talking about the coldest winters in human history. The ones that didn't just require an extra blanket, but rewrote maps, toppled kings, and made entire civilizations question all their life choices. So if you're ready, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's just drift into the cold. Now, to understand a truly historic winter, you have to forget the modern one. Forget the snow day, the cozy hot chocolate, the pretty Instagram shot of a frozen pond. Think instead of a silence so profound it feels like pressure, of a cold so deep that firelight seems weak, and the idea of spring feels like a fairy tale you once heard but can no longer quite believe. This is the cold that changes things. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow, relentless weight of a glacier. It is the ultimate background character in history, and sometimes it decides to step into the spotlight. Our story doesn't start with a blizzard, but with a volcano. Of course it does, because why would something simple like, say, a gradual shift in ocean currents be responsible? No, we need drama. We need the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in what is now Indonesia. This wasn't a gentle burp of ash. This was the planet's largest volcanic eruption in over 1,300 years. It blew its summit to pieces, killed tens of thousands directly, and filled the stratosphere with a sun-dimming veil of sulfate aerosols. The particles drifted, they circulated, and by 1816 they had settled into a kind of planetary sunshade. The sun rose and set, but its warmth just didn't arrive. What followed was the year without a summer, but that's a gentle, almost poetic name for what happened across the Northern Hemisphere. In Europe and North America, 1816 was the year without a lot of things, without reliable crops, without predictable weather, without, for many, hope. In May, June, and July, killing frosts swept across New England and Western Europe. Farmers, who had planted with the cautious optimism that spring traditionally provides, watched their seedlings turn black and wilt. They replanted. The frost came again. It was like nature had forgotten how to be a farmer. Snow fell in Vermont in June. Lake ice was reported in Pennsylvania in July. In Switzerland, the endless cold and rain trapped a group of vacationing literary friends inside a villa. Because what else are you going to do when your alpine holiday turns into a gray, dripping prison? They told ghost stories. One of them, Mary Shelley, came up with a little tale about a doctor and his creation. So you can thank the volcanic winter of 1816 for Frankenstein, a monster born from boredom and bad weather. But for the vast majority of people, this wasn't a creative writing exercise. This was a hunger crisis. Grain prices skyrocketed. In parts of Europe, desperate people resorted to eating pigeons, rats, and nettles. There were food riots from England to Switzerland. A wave of migration began from colder regions, particularly New England, where farmers gave up on the unforgiving soil and headed west to the Ohio River Valley, thinking, or at least hoping, that the weather gods might be kinder there. The cold, in its indirect, cruel way, was redrawing the map of American settlement. And all the while, the governments of the day, well, they mostly just watched. What could they do? They had no meteorology, no understanding of atmospheric science. Some blamed sunspots, others the judgment of God. The Prince Regent in England, the future George IV, was largely preoccupied with his debts, his mistresses, and his extravagant renovations to the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. A pavilion, incidentally, built in a flamboyant, fake Oriental style that looked about as suited to a volcanic winter as a paper umbrella in a hurricane. The contrast is almost too perfect. While peasants foraged for roots, the man who would be king was worrying over the placement of dragon-shaped roof finials, because, of course he was. The cold of 1816 didn't just kill crops, it exposed the fragile scaffolding of early industrial society. It showed how a single external shock, a distant volcano, could make the entire creaky system shudder. It was a preview, in a way, of how our modern, interconnected world is still vulnerable to the old, simple things. Too hot, too cold, too dry, too wet. The basics. We build our empires on them, and sometimes they just decide not to cooperate. But the year without a summer was a brief, if brutal, visitor, a sudden, violent shake of the climatic dice. To find winters that truly settled in, that made themselves at home in human history for generations, we have to drift back much, much further, to a time when the cold wasn't an event, but an era. A long, slow exhale of the planet that historians, with their flair for the dramatic, call the Little Ice Age. Roughly from the 14th to the mid-19th century, the world, and particularly the North Atlantic region, just cooled down. Not by a lot in global terms, a degree or two Celsius on average, but enough. Enough to extend glaciers, enough to shorten growing seasons by weeks, enough to make the Thames in London freeze solid repeatedly, so that they could hold frost fairs on the river with temporary pubs, shops, and even bowling alleys set up on the ice. It sounds charming, a festive oddity, but it was a symptom of a deeper, persistent malaise, the kind of cold that accumulates in the cellar of a civilization, slowly warping the beams.
This was the backdrop against which so much of early modern European history played out. The famines, the wars, the plagues, the social unrest, they all happened in this colder world. The climate wasn't the sole cause, but it was the stressful, hungry, miserable stage manager. It set the scene for disaster. Take, for instance, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. This was right at the dawn of the Little Ice Age. Years of relentlessly awful weather, cold, torrential rains that rotted seeds in the ground, led to catastrophic crop failures across northern Europe. The price of grain in some places increased by over 300%. Chroniclers of the time wrote of people eating dogs, cats, even their own children. They wrote of mass graves, of beggars dying by the roadsides, of a pervasive sense that the world's natural order had broken. Society, which was built on a foundation of agricultural surplus, suddenly had no surplus. The thin veneer of medieval order cracked, and what seeped out was desperation. And what was the nobility doing during this time? Well, many of them were busy fighting, because 1314, the year before the famine really bit, saw the pivotal Battle of Bannockburn, where Robert the Bruce secured Scottish independence from England. Wars, as it turns out, are terrible for food security. They disrupt planting, they burn crops, they conscript farmers. So while kings and nobles were jostling over territory and honor, the very people who worked that territory were starving to death in a downpour. The priorities, as always, were perfectly misaligned. The cold didn't cause the famine directly, the rain did, but the cooling climate created the conditions where such persistent, devastating weather patterns became more likely. It shifted the odds, and the odds, for a few brutal years, came up snake eyes for an entire continent. This is the pattern we'll see again and again. The cold itself is rarely the executioner, it's the accomplice. It's the one who turns out the lights, tripping up a society that's already stumbling in the dark. It amplifies every other problem. A grain shortage becomes a famine. A political dispute becomes a revolt. A king's bad mood becomes a tyranny. Because when everyone is cold, hungry, and afraid, the margin for error shrinks to zero. And speaking of kings with bad moods, let's float over in our slow, sleepy way to one of the most famously dysfunctional monarchs of the 17th century, a man who ruled at the very heart of the Little Ice Age, a man whose personal winters of the soul were matched by the very real, very physical winters outside his palace windows. A man who truly embodied the phrase divine right, and whose divine right, it seemed, included the right to be absolutely spectacularly miserable and to make everyone else miserable too. Let's talk about Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, the man who built Versailles, who dominated European politics, whose very nickname was a statement of radiant, unstoppable power. He picked the worst possible celestial body to name himself after, because the Sun King reigned during some of the coldest decades of the Little Ice Age, a period known with characteristic academic dryness as the Maunder Minimum, a time of remarkably low solar activity, coinciding with remarkably harsh European winters. The sun, in both the literal and metaphorical sense, was not at its peak. And this is where we'll settle for tonight, with the image of the most powerful man in Europe, wrapped in layers of fine wool and velvet, standing by a window in the impossibly vast, drafty palace of Versailles. He's looking out at the Grand Canal, which is not a shimmering avenue for gondolas, but a solid, flat, white plain of ice. The fountains are silent, frozen solid. The ornamental gardens are brittle geometric skeletons. Hundreds of courtiers shiver in the state apartments, their breath visible in the air, because heating a building that size was a fantasy. They are all performing an elaborate silent ballet of power and proximity, dancing for the king's favor while their toes go numb. Louis demanded this. He centralized the entire French nobility here, at Versailles, to control them. He turned them into performers in his daily rituals: the lever, the waking up, the coucher, the going to bed, every meal a public spectacle. It was a masterpiece of political theater, but in the deep winter, the theater became a trap. The cold seeped in, indifferent to rank or title. The Sun King's radiant power could not, in the end, melt the ice on the canal. He could command armies, but he could not command the spring to come a week earlier. It's the perfect ironic contrast, the apex of human-designed absolutism, humbled by a few degrees of temperature drop. The court, a glittering machine of gossip and ambition, forced to slow down, to huddle, to feel the fundamental discomfort of being a warm-blooded animal in a cold world. They wrote letters about the cold. They complained about it in their diaries. It was the great, boring, inescapable equalizer.
And outside the palace gates in the countryside, the cold was not an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. The Great Frost of 1709, during Louis's long reign, was one of the most brutal winters ever recorded in Europe. Temperatures plummeted so low that wine and spirits froze solid in their barrels. Trees split open with the sound of gunshots. Birds fell dead from the sky. The wheat crop was obliterated. People literally froze to death in their beds. Louis XIV was fighting the War of the Spanish Succession at the time, a sprawling, expensive conflict over who should sit on the throne of Spain. His armies were fighting in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Italy, and back home, his subjects were freezing and starving. The tax collectors, however, did not take a winter break. The war had to be paid for, so the demands on a shattered, frozen peasantry continued. The Sun King's grand geopolitical designs required fuel, and that fuel was squeezed from a population that had no grain, no warmth, and dwindling hope. This is the quiet tragedy of historic cold. It happens in layers. At the top, it's an anecdote, a line in a courtier's memoir about the year the canal froze so thick they roasted an ox on the ice. In the middle, it's a hardship, a worry about prices and supplies. And at the bottom, it's a silent, numbing end. History, of course, remembers the anecdote. The courtier's memoir survives. The frozen peasant does not get a diary entry. But the cold, in its patient, pervasive way, kept its own records. It's there in the tree rings, showing stunted growth for years. It's there in the paintings of the Dutch masters.
Peter Bruegel the Elder's Hunters in the Snow, with its stark white landscape and the tiny dark figures of men and dogs trudging home under a heavy sky. It's not a painting of a winter's day, it's a painting of the winter, the one that never quite ends, the one that lives in the muscle memory of a culture. And it's there in the slow, grinding change of societies. The Little Ice Age has been linked by historians to everything from the frequency of witch hunts, because what better explanation for a failed crop than maleficent magic, to the social unrest that boiled over in the French Revolution later in the 18th century. A population worn down by centuries of harder, less reliable agriculture is a population with shorter fuses and sharper grievances. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That's a story for another, equally cold night. For now, just hold the image. The Sun King in his silent, frozen palace. The absolute monarch, master of all he surveyed, brought to a seasonal standstill by the same force that felled the sparrow in the field. The cold respects no title. It is the ultimate democratizer. And it was just getting started. We'll pause here. The fire's low, the night is deep. The cold outside, wherever you are, is just a modern echo, a gentle reminder. But the story of the great winters, it has only just begun to settle in. So rest. We'll continue drifting soon enough. Welcome back. The embers are still glowing, I hope. The night is still holding that perfect, heavy quiet. Last time, we left the Sun King shivering in his gilded cage, the weight of an empire feeling a little heavier under a blanket of frost. But Louis XIV, for all his winter troubles, died in his bed, his dynasty intact. The cold isn't always so polite. Sometimes it doesn't just inconvenience kings, it breaks them. So let's drift eastward now, away from the formal gardens of Versailles, across the map of Europe. Let's go to a place where winter isn't a seasonal visitor, but a permanent resident in the national psyche. A place where they have a word, morose, that means more than just frost. It means a deep, personified, malicious cold. Let's go to Russia, because if you want to see what happens when historic cold meets historic ambition, you need look no further than the winter of 1812 and the man who famously underestimated it, Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, Napoleon was a man who understood power. He had reshaped Europe through force of will and military genius. By 1812, he was at the peak of his influence. He controlled an empire that stretched from Spain to Poland. But there was one persistent, nagging problem on his periphery: Russia. Tsar Alexander I had drifted away from Napoleon's continental system, the trade blockade against Britain. Napoleon, never one for subtle diplomacy when a grand army would do, decided to bring Russia to heel. He assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, the Grande Armée, over 600,000 men strong, drawn from all corners of his empire. It was a multicultural, multilingual force, a testament to his imperial reach. He pointed it east. The campaign began in June. The classic mistake, of course. You don't start a war in Russia in June if you want to finish it before the weather turns. But Napoleon was confident. He was always confident. He expected a decisive, quick battle. The Russians wisely gave him the opposite. They retreated. They drew him deeper and deeper into the vastness of their country, burning crops and villages as they went, a scorched earth policy. It was a strategy of patience, of space, and of a deep, unspoken faith in an old, reliable ally.
Napoleon captured Moscow in September, but it was a hollow victory. The city, largely abandoned, was set on fire. By the retreating Russians or by accident, historians still debate. It doesn't matter. The point is, Napoleon found himself occupying a smoldering ruin, not a functioning capital. He waited in the Kremlin for over a month, expecting Tsar Alexander to sue for peace. The Tsar, sitting comfortably in St. Petersburg, gave him nothing but silence. And then the temperature began to drop.
The retreat from Moscow, which began in late October, is one of history's great tragedies of hubris. It wasn't just the cold, though the cold was catastrophic. It was the convergence of everything. The exhausted, starving troops, the lack of winter clothing — the army had expected a swift campaign — the relentless harassment by Russian Cossacks and partisans, and the cold that turned the retreat into a frozen nightmare. The first major snows fell in early November. Then the real cold hit. Temperatures plunged to -30, -40 degrees Celsius. Men who had marched triumphantly across Europe just months before now died in ditches, their bodies frozen in place. Horses, vital for transport and cavalry, dropped by the thousands, to be butchered for meat or simply left as grim markers on the road. Discipline dissolved. The Grande Armée ceased to be an army and became a mob of desperate, freezing individuals. Napoleon famously abandoned his army in early December, rushing back to Paris to secure his political position, a move that did not exactly endear him to the freezing survivors. By the time the remnants staggered back across the Niemen River into Poland, only about 25,000 effective troops remained. Over 500,000 men had been lost. To battle, yes, but overwhelmingly to starvation, disease, and the cold. The Russian winter didn't defeat Napoleon's tactics, it nullified them. It made his genius for artillery placement and cavalry charges utterly irrelevant. You can't outmaneuver a blizzard. You can't intimidate a frost. The cold acted as a great, indifferent leveler, reducing the most powerful military machine in the world to a shivering, ragged procession of ghosts. And the impact? It was the beginning of the end for Napoleon. His myth of his invincibility was shattered, frozen, and left on the road to Smolensk. His allies grew restless. His enemies, emboldened, formed a new coalition. Within 2 years, he would be exiled to Elba. The Russian winter hadn't just defeated an army, it had cracked the foundation of an entire empire, all while the Tsar barely had to lift a finger. He just had to wait and trust in the old, brutal logic of his homeland. But let's not give winter all the credit. It had help from human nature. Napoleon's fatal error wasn't invading Russia. Others had done it with mixed results. His error was in his planning, or lack thereof. He treated the environment as a minor variable, a backdrop. For Russia, the environment is the main character. It's the stage, the director, and the final critic. Napoleon, the ultimate micromanager, failed to manage for the one thing he couldn't control: the sky. It's an old story, really. The conqueror who believes his will can reshape geography. They never learn, and winter is always there, waiting to teach the lesson again. Speaking of lessons unlearned, let's slide forward in time, about 130 years, to another ambitious, ideologically driven leader who looked at the vastness of Russia, now the Soviet Union, and thought, "I can do it better." Of course he did. Adolf Hitler's Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, is almost a grotesque echo of Napoleon's folly. The parallels are almost too neat to be believed. The largest invasion force in history? Check. Launched in June? Check. Confidence in a quick, decisive victory before winter? Check. A fundamental underestimation of both the Soviet resistance and the Russian winter? Double check. The German Wehrmacht was initially devastatingly effective. It drove deep into Soviet territory, capturing millions of soldiers. But like Napoleon, Hitler found that capturing land wasn't the same as winning the war. The Soviet regime didn't collapse. It retreated, burned everything of value, and fought with a desperate, brutal tenacity. And then, once again, winter arrived. The winter of 1941-1942 was particularly severe, even by Russian standards. German soldiers who had been told they'd be home by Christmas were still wearing their summer uniforms. Their machinery wasn't designed for such extreme cold. Tank engines seized, rifle bolts froze. Frostbite caused more casualties than Soviet bullets in some sectors. the German advance ground to a halt literally at the gates of Moscow. In early December, with German reconnaissance units able to see the spires of the Kremlin through field glasses, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive in freezing conditions they were better prepared for. The German line, overextended and freezing, was pushed back. Moscow was saved.
Now, did winter single-handedly defeat Nazi Germany? No. The sheer industrial might of the Soviet Union, the sacrifice of its people, and the strategic mistakes of Hitler were all paramount. But winter was the great force multiplier for the Soviets and the great demoralizer for the Germans. It turned a difficult campaign into an impossible one. It gave the Red Army a crucial breather, a chance to regroup and bring fresh, winter-equipped Siberian divisions to the front. There's a famous photo from that time, a line of German prisoners of war trudging through a snowy landscape, their greatcoats looking pathetically thin, their faces hollow with a combination of defeat and sheer cold. They look less like the master race and more like Napoleon's lost soldiers, reincarnated for another round of historical punishment. The lesson, it seems, has to be taught to every generation of would-be conquerors. The curriculum is always the same, Geography 101, with a lab component in hypothermia. But these are the big, dramatic winters, the ones that feature in every documentary. What about the slower, quieter winters of decline? The cold that doesn't smash an army in a season, but strangles a civilization over a century. Let's drift much further back, to the edge of recorded history in the Americas, to a people known for their architectural brilliance, their mathematical and astronomical precision, their sprawling cities in the jungle, the Maya. The classic Maya civilization, which peaked between 250 and 900 AD, didn't fall to a volcanic winter or a single icy catastrophe. Its collapse was a slow, complex unraveling. But climate science, specifically the study of ancient lake sediments and stalagmites, has revealed a telling pattern. The period of the Maya's decline coincides with a series of prolonged, severe droughts. A dry cold, if you will, a winter of rainlessness. For a civilization built in a subtropical environment, one that relied on seasonal rainfall for agriculture and to fill their intricate reservoir systems, this was an existential threat. Crop failures would have led to famine, social unrest, and warfare between city-states competing for dwindling resources. The priestly class, whose authority was based on their ability to predict the rains and please the gods, would have seen their power evaporate as surely as the water in the reservoirs. Imagine the slow, dawning horror. Year after year, the rains are less reliable. The corn withers. The reservoirs, those marvels of engineering, sit half empty, then nearly empty. The populace looks to the temples on the Great Pyramids. The priests perform the ceremonies, make the offerings, perhaps even more fervently, more desperately, but the sky remains a hard, cloudless blue. The authority of the gods, mediated through the king-priests, cracks under the heat and the silence. It wasn't one winter that did it. It was a creeping, multi-generational winter of scarcity. The Maya didn't vanish, they abandoned their great ceremonial centers. The population dispersed, moving to smaller, more sustainable settlements. The grand project of classic Maya civilization, the towering pyramids, the complex calendars, the courtly life, simply became untenable. The climate shifted, and the civilization, too rigid to adapt quickly, fragmented. This is the other face of a historic winter, not the sudden, violent frost, but the long, dry chill of change. It doesn't topple a throne in a season, it rots the foundations of a society over 100 years. It's less cinematic, but in some ways more profound. It speaks to the deep, intimate link between human civilization and the environmental niche it builds itself into. When that niche changes, the civilization must change, or wither. From the frozen retreat from Moscow to the parched cities of the Yucatan, the message is similar. We build our empires on the assumption that the world will cooperate, that the rains will come, that the winters will be manageable, that the sun will, in fact, keep shining. It's the most basic contract, and we often forget we've even signed it, until the day the terms change.
And with that thought, we'll let the silence settle again. The cold outside is just a suggestion, a whisper of those greater winters. But the story isn't done. There are more frosts to come, more kings to be humbled, more societies to be tested. So rest. We'll continue this slow, cold drift soon. So we've seen the cold break armies and crumble civilizations. But what about the everyday, grinding cold? The kind that doesn't make the history books with a capital W winter, but just lingers. The kind that seeps into the cracks of ordinary life and changes the texture of an era. This is the cold of the long, dim 17th century, the heart of the Little Ice Age in Europe. And to understand it, we need to leave the battlefields and step into a different kind of theater, the royal court. Not Versailles this time. Let's go somewhere smaller, more intimate, and arguably even more dysfunctional. Let's go to Madrid, to the court of the Spanish Habsburgs, specifically to the reign of Charles II. He's often remembered as Charles the Bewitched, the last of his line, a man so riddled with genetic disorders from generations of inbreeding that he was a living, breathing testament to the dangers of keeping royal blood too pure. But tonight, we're not focusing on his famous Habsburg jaw, or his infertility, or the desperate spells his courtiers tried to cure him with. Tonight, we're thinking about how he and everyone around him must have felt the cold. Charles II was sickly his entire life. He was epileptic, physically weak, and developmentally disabled. He was also the king of a global empire that was in rapid, inexorable decline. The wealth from the New World was drying up, wars were draining the treasury, and the atmosphere in his court was one of hushed, superstitious desperation. And on top of all that, the 17th century was brutally cold. Picture the grand, gloomy halls of the Alcázar of Madrid, stone floors, high vaulted ceilings, tapestries on the walls that moved slightly in the drafts. There was no central heating, of course. Heat came from fireplaces, and the heat from a fireplace is a selfish, local thing. It doesn't warm a room, it warms the space directly in front of it. So the court life would have organized itself in rings around these sources of warmth, like planets orbiting a weak, flickering sun. The king, wrapped in layers of velvet and furs, would have had the prime position. His closest advisors, the validos, who really ran the country, would be next. Then the lesser nobles, the favor seekers, the priests, the ambassadors, all arranged in a strict hierarchy of proximity to both the monarch and the fire. The gossip, the plotting, the whispered prayers for the king's health, all conducted in visible clouds of breath. And Charles himself, poor man, his illnesses would have been exacerbated by the cold, joint pain, stiffness, malaise, all the general misery of a perpetual winter chill, layered on top of his already profound suffering. His doctors prescribed all manner of absurd remedies, potions, poultices, the drinking of water in which holy relics had been dipped, but they couldn't prescribe the one thing that might have offered some comfort: a warm, consistently heated room. It simply didn't exist. So the court becomes a perfect metaphor, a shivering, insular microcosm of an empire that's losing its warmth, its vitality, its connection to the outside world. The focus turns inward, on the fragile, failing body of the king, because that's the only source of power anyone can see, even if it's fading. The big geopolitical projects, the ambitions of a Charles V or a Philip II, are gone, replaced by a daily struggle for personal position, for a spot nearer the fire, and by a superstitious hope that maybe, just maybe, if they pray hard enough, God will lift whatever curse is upon the king and, by extension, upon Spain. The cold outside mirrors the cold within, a spiritual and political winter. When Charles II finally died in 1700, childless, he left a will that plunged Europe into the War of the Spanish Succession, the same war that Louis XIV was fighting during the Great Frost of 1709. The cold, in a way, closed a loop. One shivering, dying king's end sparked a conflict that would see thousands of soldiers from another empire freeze to death a decade later. History's connections are often just strands of frost, linking one tragedy to the next. But let's pull back from the courts and the kings for a moment. Let's think about the artists, because the cold of the Little Ice Age didn't just shape politics and survival. It shaped how people saw their world. It shaped art. We mentioned the Dutch winter landscapes earlier. Painters like Hendrik Averkamp specialized in them. His works are bustling, detailed scenes of life on the ice, people skating, playing kolf, a precursor to golf, socializing, buying and selling from temporary stalls. At first glance, they look festive, charming, a celebration of community in the face of the cold. But look closer. The skies are almost always a heavy, uniform gray. The light is flat and dim, the kind of light that makes everything look etched, not glowing. The colors are muted, dirty whites, browns, slate grays, the occasional dull red of a coat. And in the corners, there are often little vignettes of less festive reality. A man having fallen through the ice, people huddled miserably around a small brazier, a beggar sitting alone in the cold. These paintings are documentaries. They show a society that has been forced to adapt, to carve its life out of the frozen months. The ice isn't just a novelty, it's a temporary public square, a market, a highway. But the adaptation is tinged with hardship. The cold is the main character, and the people are just moving through its domain, making the best of it. The art captures the normalization of extreme weather. This isn't a freak event. This is life now. Get your skates on, business as usual, just don't fall in. Then there's the literature. Think of Shakespeare. His world was the Elizabethan and Jacobean era, smack in the middle of the cooling period. References to harsh winters pop up throughout his plays. In The Winter's Tale, he writes of a world so frozen it seems magical, but also punitive. But a more subtle effect might be the general atmosphere of his later tragedies, the claustrophobia, the paranoia, the sense of a world out of joint in Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear. These are plays written for audiences who knew what it was to be trapped indoors for long periods by darkness and cold. The psychological intensity, the focus on interior torment, feels like an art form born of long, contemplative winters. Even our language bears the frost. Phrases like frosty reception, cold-hearted, icy stare, in the cold light of day, they root our metaphors for emotional distance and harsh clarity in the physical experience of profound cold. The Little Ice Age didn't just give us pretty paintings, it gave us a vocabulary for human isolation. And what about the food? This is a quieter, hungrier thread. The long winters meant a reliance on preserved foods, salted meat, pickled vegetables, hard cheese, dried grains. The diet was monotonous, lacking in vitamins. Scurvy wasn't just a sailor's disease, it could be a winter peasant's disease too. The lack of fresh food for months on end sapped energy, weakened immune systems, and made populations more susceptible to the waves of disease that swept through Europe. The cold didn't just kill directly, it prepared the ground for plague and pestilence. It also, in a strange way, gave us some comforts. The desire for warmth and stimulation in those long indoor hours fueled the popularity of hot drinks. Tea became a major trade commodity. Coffee houses sprang up as places to gather, talk, and get warm. Chocolate, introduced from the Americas, became a luxurious heated drink for the elite. The rituals we associate with coziness, gathering around a hearth with a warm beverage, are in part cultural adaptations to centuries of really unpleasant winters. We learned to build little islands of warmth and to make those islands socially and culturally productive. So the story of the Great Winters isn't just one of catastrophe, it's also a story of quiet, grinding adaptation, of learning to paint the gray sky, of building a social life on a frozen river, of turning a season of scarcity into a reason for new rituals. It's about the human capacity to normalize almost anything, even a world that's a few degrees colder than it should be. But adaptation has its limits, and sometimes the cold pushes a society right up to and over the edge of what it can bear. For that, we need to drift north, far north, to a place where winter wasn't an event or an era, but the fundamental condition of existence, to the very edge of the habitable world, where two societies made a choice, one to stay and fight the cold, and one to simply vanish. We'll pause on that thought. The fire's getting low again. The night feels a little deeper. Where we're going next, the silence is even older, and the cold is not just a force of nature, but a character in a mystery. Rest for now. The drift continues into the long dark. Our drift carries us north now, beyond the chronicles of kings and the oil paintings of skaters, beyond the reach of even the most stubborn medieval peasant. We're going to the literal edge of the medieval world, to a place that, in its very name, was a masterpiece of optimistic marketing: Greenland. The story of the Norse settlements in Greenland is a slow-motion lesson in the cold, not a sudden, catastrophic winter, but a gradual turning of the screw, a shift so incremental that the people living through it might not have even noticed the threshold being crossed until it was far, far behind them. The Norse, led by Eric the Red, a man whose nickname conveniently distracts from the fact he was exiled for murder, settled Greenland around 985 AD. This was during the medieval warm period, a time when the North Atlantic was, comparatively, balmy. The name Greenland was Eric's sales pitch to potential settlers, and for a while, it wasn't entirely a lie. The settlers established two main communities, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. They built stone churches, kept cattle and sheep, traded walrus ivory and polar bear skins with Europe. They were, for a few centuries, a functioning outlier of medieval Christendom. But then, the climate began to change. The medieval warm period tapered off, and the long slide into the Little Ice Age began. The seasons shortened, the ice sea expanded, making trade voyages to Iceland and Norway more dangerous and less frequent. The growing season for grass, vital for fodder, grew shorter. The Norse were pastoralists at heart, clinging to a European identity. They insisted on farming livestock, on building churches in the Romanesque style, on wearing woolen clothing. Their identity was tied to being Norse, not to being Arctic. Meanwhile, the Thule culture ancestors of the modern Inuit were moving into the same regions. Their adaptation was total. They were hunters of sea mammals. They used skin boats, wore tailored sealskin clothing that was far superior to wool in the damp cold, built semi-subterranean houses insulated with sod, and their diet was rich in fat and protein from seals and whales. They were fluid, pragmatic, and exquisitely adapted to the very environment that was becoming increasingly hostile to the Norse way of life. The Norse saw them, of course. The sagas call them scragglings. There was some trade and likely some conflict, but the Norse largely looked down on them. To a Norse chieftain, a man was measured by his church, his cattle, and his connection to the bishop of Nidaros. The Inuit way of life would have seemed primitive, pagan, and fundamentally other. So they didn't learn, they didn't adopt the superior clothing or hunting techniques, they just tried harder to be good Norse farmers in a land that was increasingly telling them it was not a farming land. The cold here isn't a sudden killer, it's a selector. It doesn't send a blizzard to wipe out a settlement in one night, it sends a series of slightly longer winters, one after another. It reduces the hay yield by a few % each year. It makes the seal hunts a little more perilous as the ice changes. It isolates them, slowly cutting the frail maritime thread connecting them to Europe. The last recorded ship from Norway arrived in the early 15th century. After that, silence. The end of the Norse Greenland wasn't a dramatic collapse discovered by outsiders. It was a fading, a gradual starving, a gradual freezing, a gradual decision by each remaining family, in the face of a child's hunger, to perhaps finally try eating like a scraggling, only to find they no longer remembered how to learn. By the time any European ship thought to check on them again, perhaps decades later, they'd find only empty stone longhouses, the bones of stunted cattle, and a few Gothic church walls pointing emptily at a gray sky. The cold had simply waited them out. It had all the time in the world. The irony is almost too perfect. The settlers who clung most tightly to their European identity, who tried to impose a temperate model on an Arctic world, were the ones who vanished. The adaptable, pragmatic culture, with no stone churches and no written sagas, survived and thrived. The cold rewarded flexibility and punished dogma. It's a lesson that echoes far beyond the fjords of Greenland.
But let's shift from a slow fade to a much more concentrated and much more American tragedy. Let's jump forward to the winter of 1846-47. Let's go to the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, and let's talk about a name that has become synonymous with catastrophic winter survival: the Donner Party. Now, the story of the Donner Party is often told as a horror story, and it was. It was a descent into starvation, madness, and cannibalism. But strip away the sensationalism, and you find, at its core, another story about human miscalculation in the face of the cold. The Donner and Reed families weren't fools. They were pioneers, part of the Great Wagon Train migration westward. But they made a fatal error. They took a shortcut. A man named Lansford Hastings had published a guide promising a faster route to California, bypassing the established trail. It was untested. It was, as it turned out, a lie woven from ambition and guesswork. The Hastings cutoff cost them precious weeks, forcing them to hack their way through the Wasatch Mountains and across the salt flats of Utah. By the time they approached the final barrier, the Sierra Nevada, it was late October. Winter in the high Sierras comes early and with immense force. An early series of storms in October trapped them. They were stranded at what is now called Donner Lake, high above the pass they needed to cross. They built crude shelters. They slaughtered their oxen. They tried to hunt, but the snows kept coming. 30-foot drifts buried their cabins. The cold was absolute. What's fascinating and terribly sad is the slow breakdown of societal norms. At first, they were a community. They shared what little they had. They held on to the hope of rescue. But as the weeks turned to months and the food vanished, the community atomized into family units and then into individuals. The decisions made in the dark, frozen silence of those shelters were private, desperate, and ultimately horrific. The cold and hunger didn't just break their bodies, it broke the very covenants of civilization. When the first rescue parties finally broke through in February, they found a scene of Gothic misery that would haunt the American conscience. The Donner Party's winter wasn't a historical climate shift. It was a personal, acute collision with a mountain winter they were unprepared for. Their tragedy was a perfect storm of bad advice, poor timing, and the sheer indifferent power of a Sierra snowpack. They were not brought low by a century of cooling, but by a single savage season. It's a reminder that on an individual human scale, you don't need a little ice age. One winter in the wrong place is more than enough. These two stories, the slow Greenland fade and the acute Donner horror, bookend the ways cold can end a human story. One is a patient, generations-long whisper of failure. The other is a single, deafening shout. Both end in silence. But history isn't just about endings. It's also about the strange, stubborn life that persists in the cold. So let's drift to a place where life didn't end, but was forced into a bizarre, concentrated, and oddly creative form.
let's go to St. Petersburg in the winter of 1824-25, not for a famine or a war, but for a flood. The Neva River, which winds through the city, was prone to catastrophic flooding when strong westerly winds would push water from the Gulf of Finland back into its mouth. In November 1824, this happened with devastating force, combined with an already frozen river and estuary. Ice jams, storm surge, and flooding killed hundreds and caused immense damage. But in the aftermath, as the city shivered and repaired, something else was happening. A group of young nobles, army officers, and intellectuals who had been exposed to liberal ideas during the Napoleonic Wars began meeting in frozen apartments and chilly drawing rooms. The oppressive atmosphere of the later years of Tsar Alexander I's reign, combined with the physical confinement of another brutal winter, created a petri dish for sedition. They plotted, they wrote manifestos, they dreamed of a constitution for Russia. Their plan was to act in the spring, but Alexander I died unexpectedly in December 1925, creating a crisis of succession. Seeing their moment, these men, the Decembrists, rallied their regiments on Senate Square in St. Petersburg on a freezing December morning. The uprising was a shambles. Confused, poorly led, and facing loyalist artillery, it was crushed within hours. The leaders were hanged or exiled to Siberia. The Decembrist revolt was a failure, but it was the first open breach between the state and a section of its own elite, a crack that would widen over the next century. And it was, in a real sense, a product of the winter. The long, dark, indoor months provided the cover for conspiracy. The harsh climate fostered a sense of interiority and discontent. The revolt itself was staged in the numbing cold, which probably didn't help the coordination of the rebels. Once again, the cold was the silent stage manager, setting the scene for a drama of doomed idealism.
From vanished colonies to stranded pioneers to failed revolutions, the pattern holds. The cold provides the constraints. It amplifies mistakes, punishes rigidity, and forces human nature into stark, often uncomfortable relief. We've seen its power to end things, but what about its power to create, to force innovation, not just adaptation? What about the winters that sparked not just survival, but a leap forward? We'll turn in that direction next, but for now, let the chill of these old silences settle around you. The Greenland fjord, empty. The Sierra Valley, still. The Neva Square, cleared of bodies and dreams. The cold preserves these memories in a kind of eternal frost. Rest. We'll seek the spark in the ice soon enough. We've spent a lot of time in the freeze, watching things end, societies fading, armies disintegrating, hopes being buried under silent white drifts. It's easy to cast the historic cold as a villain, a final, quiet judge. But what if we look at it another way? What if the extreme cold, in its relentless, demanding way, was also a teacher, a spur to a kind of frigid ingenuity? Because humans are peculiar. We don't just endure, we observe, we tinker. And sometimes, staring at a problem as vast and immutable as a 3-month-long freeze, we get clever. So let's drift into the 19th century again, but not to a tragedy this time. Let's go to a frozen pond in New England, and let's talk about a commodity so absurd it's brilliant. Ice. Before mechanical refrigeration, if you wanted something cold in the summer, you were out of luck, unless you were very rich and had an ice house, a deeply insulated underground pit stocked with blocks of ice cut from a lake during winter. This was a luxury, a parlor trick for the elite. But then a Bostonian named Frederick Tudor looked at the frozen ponds of Massachusetts and saw not a seasonal inconvenience, but a gold mine. He saw an export. Tudor, later known as the Ice King, had a mad idea. He would ship New England winter to the tropics. In 1806, he sent his first cargo of ice to Martinique. It was, by most measures, a disaster. He lost a fortune. The locals had no idea what to do with it,
But Tudor was stubborn, a trait that seems essential for anyone who chooses to battle thermodynamics for a living. He refined his techniques. He designed better insulated holds using sawdust. He figured out how to cut cleaner, clearer blocks that melted slower. And then he struck upon his masterpiece. He created demand. He went to places like Calcutta and taught bartenders how to make ice-cooled drinks. He offered ice boxes to hospitals to preserve medicine. He created a market for a sensation people didn't know they were missing: coldness, on demand in a sweltering climate. By the mid-19th century, Tudor's ice was a global commodity. Ships laden with glistening blocks sailed from Boston to Rio to Havana to Hong Kong. New England's winters were being harvested, packaged, and sold. Ice houses sprung up in ports around the world. The winter of Massachusetts was chilling the drinks of British colonists in India. It's a surreal image. The very thing that had constrained human activity for millennia, the deep freeze, had been turned into a tool of comfort and commerce. Of course, it was a fraught, ironic enterprise. The work of harvesting the ice was brutally cold and dangerous. Men wielding saws on unstable ice, hauling monstrous blocks, working in conditions that could kill them in minutes, all so someone in Calcutta could have a slightly less tepid gin and tonic. The luxury at one end of the chain was built on sheer, frozen hardship at the other, because of course it was. But the principle was revolutionary. It was the beginning of humanity's effort to decouple ourselves from the immediate climate. We weren't just enduring winter, we were capturing its essence and shipping it across oceans to defy summer. It was the first step toward the air-conditioned, refrigerated world we live in now. All because someone looked at a frozen lake and thought, what if we sold it? This spirit of confronting the cold not just with endurance, but with engineering, reached its most poignant expression in the polar explorations of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, and it is a catalog of cold-adapted hubris. Men like Robert Falcon Scott, Ernest Shackleton, and Roald Amundsen were the apostles of a new faith, the faith in wool, in sledges, in sheer British or Norwegian pluck. Their preparations were meticulous, born from hard lessons. They studied Inuit and Norse clothing designs, eventually adopting layered furs and skins. They debated the merits of man-hauling versus dog teams versus ponies, a debate Scott tragically got wrong. They designed special diets of pemmican, a concentrated paste of fat and protein, and high-energy biscuits. They were trying to biohack their way across the last blank spaces on the map.
And in their journals, we see the cold not as a historical force, but as a daily, intimate antagonist. Scott's journals from his fatal Terra Nova expedition are full of it, not with grand drama, but with a grinding, specific misery, the agony of frostbitten fingertips, the relentless struggle to light a Primus stove with numb hands, the great discomfort of sleeping bags stiff with frozen breath, the way metal would stick to flesh and wood would splinter like glass. This was cold as a tactile, all-consuming reality. It was a job to be managed, hour by hour, and they were the managers, slowly losing control of the account. The contrast between Amundsen and Scott is the perfect case study in cultural adaptation to cold. Amundsen, a Norwegian, approached the Arctic and Antarctic as a technical problem to be solved with the best tools available. He used dog teams expertly, skied efficiently, and learned from indigenous Arctic peoples. He saw the environment as a system to be understood and leveraged. Scott, a product of the British Royal Navy, saw it more as a test of character. He valorized man-hauling, was ambivalent about dogs, and maintained a kind of stiff upper lip approach that placed moral fortitude above optimal technique. The cold, of course, did not care about character. It only cared about thermodynamics. Amundsen reached the South Pole first and returned safely. Scott and his men died on the return journey, trapped by weather and starvation just 11 miles from a supply depot. The cold in these stories is the ultimate auditor. It audits your preparations, your cultural biases, your flexibility. It exposes sentimentality and rewards pragmatism. Scott's last journal entry is heartbreaking. "For God's sake, look after our people." It's the plea of a man who commanded an empire's resources, reduced to a whisper in a frozen tent, finally understanding that the cold had outlasted his resolve. But even in these tales of frostbite and failure, there's that spark of ingenuity. The technologies developed for polar exploration, improved insulation, nutritional science, weather forecasting, trickled out into the wider world. The struggle to survive in the coldest places on Earth taught us how to make better clothing for everyone, how to preserve food better, how to understand atmospheric science. The extreme cold, once again, was a brutal but effective teacher. And then there's the cold that inspires not survival, but art of a different kind. Let's float to Russia once more, but to a different winter. The winter of 1869-70. A young composer, holed up in a small apartment, is struggling. He's ambitious, prone to self-doubt, and has a tendency to destroy his own work. His name is Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, and he's been commissioned to write a piece based on Shakespeare's The Tempest. But he's blocked. The Russian winter outside is deep. He's feeling the pressure, so his sister, seeing his state, suggests a trip. Not to a warm beach, but to Italy. He goes. He sees Venice, Rome, Naples. The warmth, the light, the color. It unlocks something. But here's the thing. He doesn't write an Italian piece. He returns to the Russian winter and in a feverish burst composes one of the most famous winter-themed pieces of music ever written, the Symphony No. 1 in G minor, nicknamed Winter Daydreams. The first movement is literally called Daydreams of a Winter Journey. It's not a depiction of blizzards and suffering. It's lyrical, melancholic, wistful. It's the sound of the mind turning inward during the long white months, of memory and imagination flourishing in the enforced stillness. The cold outside created a vacuum, and his trip to Italy filled it with contrasts, not of temperature, but of emotional color. The symphony was his way of bottling that internal journey, of making art from the seasonal rhythm of confinement and release. It's a quieter kind of adaptation, not building an ice house or planning a sledging ration, but structuring creative thought around the climate's constraints. The long winter became a creative incubator. It forced a depth of interiority that a more distractingly pleasant climate might not have. Some of the world's greatest literature, music, and philosophy from northern climates carries this signature, a certain depth, a certain brooding quality, born from long nights and frozen windows. So we see a spectrum, from Tudor selling ice to Amundsen optimizing sledges to Tchaikovsky composing daydreams. The historic cold wasn't just a destroyer, it was a demand. It demanded new technologies, new social structures, and new depths of the human spirit. It forced us to think differently about preservation, exploration, and even beauty. But for every innovation, there was a cost. For every ice baron, there were frozen laborers. For every triumphant explorer, there was a ghost in a tent. For every symphony, there was a season of stifling gloom. The cold gives and takes, teaches and takes away, often in the same frozen breath.
And with that thought, we approach a more modern chill. Not the chill of nature, but the chill we created ourselves. A political frost so deep and pervasive it defined half a century and borrowed winter's very name for its metaphor. We'll drift towards that man-made winter next, but for now, let the quiet of a winter daydream linger. The fire is just embers. The night has reached its deepest, stillest point. The cold outside is a fact, but inside, for a moment, it can be a dream, a memory, a muse. Rest. The 20th century's deep freeze awaits. Our drift brings us now out of the age of ice blocks and polar heroism and into a colder, stranger winter, one not measured in degrees Fahrenheit, but in geopolitical tension, one not caused by volcanic dust or orbital cycles, but by ideology and mutual fear. We've arrived at the 20th century and the winter that was a metaphor made real, the Cold War. But before we get to the metaphor, let's touch on a very real, very cold winter that happened right in its shadow, the winter of 1946-47 in Europe. This was the first post-war winter, and it was brutal. A continent already shattered by conflict, its infrastructure in ruins, its economies on their knees, was hit by one of the coldest, snowiest winters on record. Coal shortages were acute. People froze to death in apartments that lacked windows, let alone heat. Food rationing, which everyone had hoped would ease, tightened instead. In Britain, it was worse than the war winters. They called it the Big Freeze. And into this physical winter stepped the new geopolitical one. The lines of the Iron Curtain were hardening, and the United States, realizing that a frozen, starving Western Europe might just decide that communism looked pretty good if it promised a warm meal, launched the Marshall Plan. It was a massive injection of cash, goods, and expertise. But in that first awful winter, it was also something more immediate. It was shiploads of coal and grain. It was the literal fuel for survival. The Cold War, in its opening act, was fought with blankets and bread. The strategy was simple. You can't rally people to your ideology if they're dead of hypothermia. It was practical, and it was cynical, and it worked. This is where the metaphor and the reality start to braid together. The Cold War was a state of perpetual, managed tension. It was a season that lasted for decades, where the threat of a sudden, catastrophic nuclear winter was the unspoken backdrop to everything. It fostered its own bizarre adaptations, the construction of fallout shelters in suburban backyards, a kind of panic room for the end of the world, duck and cover drills in schools, where children practicing hiding under their desks from a thermal flash that would vaporize their city. It was all a performance, a ritual to give the illusion of control over the utterly uncontrollable. And then there were the proxy battles, fought in literally cold places. The coldest frontier of all became a stage, the Arctic. Both the US and the USSR built chains of radar stations and listening posts across the frozen north, the distant early warning line. The air forces of both nations played a continuous, silent game of cat and mouse in the icy skies, with reconnaissance planes and interceptors. It was a war of shadows on glaciers, of electronic pings echoing off icebergs. The environment itself was the enemy to both sides, even as they faced each other. Pilots had to survive not just potential enemy fire, but the certainty of killing cold if they were forced to eject over the tundra. Survival kits included fishing lines and snares, a tacit admission that the real fight might be against nature, not the other superpower. The space race, that proud, shiny competition, was also a child of this chilly tension. It was fought with rockets, yes, but also with insulation and thermal regulation systems. The first satellites and capsules were fundamentally tiny, pressurized environments trying to survive the ultimate cold and vacuum of space. When Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth, he was encased in a suit designed to keep him alive in conditions more hostile than any Antarctic winter. The quest for the stars was in part an extension of the earthly struggle to master extreme environments before the other side did. The Cold War was cold in every sense, politically, psychologically, and often physically for the men on its front lines.
But let's zoom in from the grand strategy to a single, surreal event that perfectly captures the absurd theater of it all. Let's go to Berlin in the winter of 1948-49. The city, deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, was itself divided. The Soviets, trying to squeeze the Western Allies out of their sectors, blockaded all land and water routes. West Berlin, with over 2 million people, was suddenly an island in a communist sea, with only enough food and coal for a few weeks. The Western response was the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year,
American and British planes flew a continuous clockwork shuttle into the city's airports, bringing in everything from flour and coal to medicine and candy. It was a staggering logistical feat. But imagine it on the ground, in the winter. West Berliners living in bomb-damaged buildings, facing a Soviet army just beyond the boundary, are kept alive by the constant drone of engines in the gray sky. The pilots became known as the Schokoladenflieger, the chocolate flyers, for dropping candy with tiny parachutes for children. Here, the political cold and the actual cold converged perfectly. The Soviet blockade was a pressure play, an attempt to freeze the West out. The Western airlift was the defiant response. We will create our own artificial summer of supply. We will defeat your winter with endless logistical spring. The morale of West Berliners shivering in their homes was tethered to the rhythm of the C-54 Skymasters landing at Tempelhof. Their survival was a daily act of faith in machinery and political will. And it worked. The Soviets, faced with this stubborn, humming defiance, lifted the blockade. The first major battle of the Cold War was won not with tanks, but with cargo manifests and careful fuel calculations, all conducted under a bleak German winter sky. This era, the long, tense season, also bred a unique kind of cultural frost. The paranoia of McCarthyism, the stifling conformity demanded in the Eastern Bloc, the constant low-grade fear. It was a psychological winter that inhibited free expression, that forced people to bury their true thoughts, to wear a public face as a form of insulation. The thaw, when it came in fits and starts, the Khrushchev thaw, the Prague Spring that was so brutally refrozen, was always partial, always fragile. The metaphor holds because, like a real winter, the Cold War created a kind of suspended animation. Progress on certain issues was frozen. Global development was distorted by the priorities of the bloc confrontation. Entire nations were kept in a client-state chill, their destinies not their own. It was a season of waiting, of watching the icicles grow, wondering if the next sound would be a thaw or the crack of breaking ice. And then, almost without anyone believing it at first, the thaw did come, not with a war, but with a slow melt. The late 1980s. A Soviet leader named Mikhail Gorbachev, with his policies of glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. The symbolic end came at the Berlin Wall in 1989, not in winter, but in a euphoric autumn. People danced on a wall that had stood for a generation of frost. They chipped away at it with hammers. The physical and political barrier was breached not by missiles, but by crowds and chisels. The long winter was over. The strange, tense season that had defined the planet for nearly half a century just ended. The silence left behind wasn't the silence of snow, but the dizzying, uncertain silence after a constant threatening noise has stopped. We now live in what is called by geologists the Holocene, our current interglacial period, a warm patch on Earth's climactic cycle. And we've just come through a warm patch in political terms, the post-Cold War era. But winters, as we've seen, have a habit of returning, both the literal and the metaphorical kind. The cold never really leaves the story. It just changes form. So, as we near the end of our long, sleepy drift, we have one more kind of winter to consider, not of climate, nor of politics, but of the spirit, the private frosts of the soul. That's where we'll go to finish, to the interior landscape, to the chill that comes from within. But for now, let the image of those Berlin children looking up at the gray sky for candy and salvation sit with you. A tiny moment of sweetness delivered by aircraft in the heart of a man-made winter. Rest. The final chill awaits.
We've drifted through ice ages and geopolitical deep freezes. We've seen winters that toppled empires and winters that were empires of a sort. But there is another country, one that exists on no map, where the winter is permanent, internal, and entirely human. This is the landscape of melancholy, of isolation,
of the private chill that certain historical figures seemed to carry with them, regardless of the season outside their window. This is the winter of the soul. And there is perhaps no better guide to this territory than a man who ruled an empire of sunlight and yet lived in profound shadow, Philip II of Spain. Philip ruled the Spanish Empire at its zenith, when the sun famously never set on its territories. From his massive granite monastery palace, El Escorial, he administered a global empire of unimaginable wealth and complexity, and he did it mostly alone, through paper. He was the ultimate micromanager, known as the Rey Papelero, the paperwork king. He would sit in his small, sparse study while outside the Spanish sun beat down on the arid plains, and he would annotate reports from Peru, memos from Flanders, dispatches from the Philippines. He built El Escorial as a monument to stern Catholic piety and Habsburg power, but it feels more than anything like a tomb for the living, cold, geometric, severe. His personal life was a litany of cold losses. He was married 4 times. He outlived most of his children. His son and heir, Don Carlos, was physically and mentally unstable, and Philip eventually had him imprisoned, where he died. The great love of his life, perhaps, was his 3rd wife, Elizabeth of Valois, who died young. His 4th marriage was one of duty. He presided over the relentless, exhausting defense of Catholic orthodoxy, the suppression of the Dutch revolt, the dispatching of the Armada. Every decision seemed to lead to more war, more debt, more complexity. The image we have is of a man forever in black, in a silent granite room, laboring under the weight of a world he believed God had entrusted to him, and which was, piece by piece, becoming an unbearable burden. The external sun of Spain's golden age never reached his inner chambers. He cultivated a kind of glacial patience, a slow, deliberative style that drove his advisors mad. He was not warm, he was ponderous. His winter was one of duty, isolation, and a chilling sense of divine expectation. He wasn't hated, usually. He was just fundamentally, profoundly remote, like a mountain peak that is always in snow, even in summer. Now, let's drift from the rigid formality of the Spanish court to a different kind of inner frost, one that was artistic, tempestuous, and self-aware. Let's go back to Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, but not to winter daydreams. Let's go to his later years. Tchaikovsky's inner climate was a volatile mix of Russian winter and sudden, desperate thaws. He was a deeply sensitive man, prone to bouts of crippling self-doubt and depression, which he called the abyss. He was also a homosexual in 19th century Russia, a fact that filled him with shame and terror of exposure. His marriage was a catastrophic, short-lived attempt to cure himself, which led him to a nervous breakdown and a suicide attempt by wading into the freezing Moscow River, hoping to contract pneumonia. His music is where he channeled this turbulent interior weather. It's not all winter, it's full of passionate, melodic warmth, but the shadow is always there. Listen to the Symphony No. 6, the Pathétique. The final movement is not a triumphant finale, but a slow, descending adagio of utter lament. It fades away into silence. It is the sound of a private winter settling in for good. He conducted its premiere just 9 days before his death from cholera, a death still shrouded in mystery and speculation about suicide.
For Tchaikovsky, the creative process was a temporary furnace against the inner cold. Composing was a kind of stacking of psychic firewood, but when the work was done, the chill would return, often deeper than before. His story is a reminder that the most vivid, passionate art can be born from a spirit that feels itself to be perpetually on the brink of freezing solid. But not all private winters are tragic or artistic. Some are just weird, eccentric to the point of creating a personal climate system. For that, let's visit Christina, Queen of Sweden.
She inherited the throne at age 6 in 1632 during the 30 Years' War and was raised as a prince, educated in politics, philosophy, and languages. She was brilliant, restless, and utterly uninterested in the conventional expectations of her gender or her station. After ruling for a decade, she did the unthinkable. She abdicated. She converted to Catholicism, left Protestant Sweden forever, and moved to Rome to pursue a life of intellectual and artistic patronage. Her inner winter was one of defiant, frigid independence. She refused to be defined. She dressed in men's clothing, had scandalous friendships with both men and women, and pursued knowledge with a voracious, chilly intensity. She created a legendary salon, but was known for her sharp tongue and lack of patience for fools. She was a force of will so concentrated it repelled ordinary warmth. She never married, never had children, and spent her later years in a sort of self-imposed exile of the mind, surrounded by books and art, but fundamentally alone on a philosophical plateau few could reach. Her winter was one of intellectual austerity. She chose a life of the mind over the warmth of dynasty, of tradition, of national belonging. She traded a crown for a library and seemed to find the library more alive, even if it was a quieter, cooler kind of life. She died in Rome, a queen without a kingdom, a woman who had built her own unique and rather lonely country within herself. These private winters of duty, of melancholy, of intellectual isolation are the ones history records in diaries, in letters, in the gaps between official acts. They are the human-scale counterpart to the great climatic winters. They remind us that while a volcano can dim the sun for a year, a personal sorrow can dim a life for decades. And this brings us inevitably to the final winter, the one that awaits every person in history, king or peasant, the winter of legacy, of being forgotten. For most people in the past, this winter came almost immediately. Their names, their fears, their small joys melted into the vast, anonymous snowfield of time. But even for the remembered, there is a second death, the death of context. We freeze them into caricatures. The Sun King, the Bewitched, the Ice King. We take one aspect of their complex inner climated lives and make it their entire story. We subject them to the winter of simplification. Their inner struggles, their private warmth, their nuanced contradictions are flattened by the cold pressure of history into a single manageable factoid. So perhaps the final, gentlest point of our long drift is this. History itself is a kind of winter. It preserves, but it also distorts. It picks out certain shapes against the white, a battle, a treaty, a famous death, and lets the rest, the soft contours of ordinary days and private thoughts, be buried. The cold we've been exploring, in all its forms, is the great preserver and the great eraser. It saved the mammoth for us to find, and it erased the Greenland Norse. It inspired symphonies, and it froze armies in mid-retreat. It is the background against which the human drama, in all its folly and ingenuity, has played out. And with that, our script has reached its own natural end. Not with a bang, not with a grand conclusion, but with a gradual thinning out. A sense that the stories have been told, the embers are gray, and the quiet has fully settled in. You've drifted through the coldest winters in human history. You've felt the geopolitical frost and the private chills. There are no more lessons to draw, no grand thesis to declare, just the patterns repeating like frost crystals on a window pane. Adaptation, endurance, folly, and the occasional stubborn spark of warmth against the endless white. The video would fade now, not to black, but to a still image of Bruegel painting, those tiny dark figures on a vast white expanse. The silence would stretch, and then finally the softest of spoken sign-offs. Thank you for listening. Sleep well. If you're hearing this or reading this, then the script didn't truly end, did it? You asked it to continue. And that's the most human reaction of all, to seek one more page, one more fact, one more whispered anecdote to stave off the silence that follows a finished tale. But the story of cold has been told. We've drifted from volcanic winters to soul winters, from ice merchants to shivering kings. There is no part 11. There is only the silence we've been circling this whole time. That was always the point. The sleepless historian style isn't about excitement or revelation. It's about the gentle, monotonous accumulation of detail, until the details themselves become a kind of atmospheric pressure, a soft weight. The goal was never to keep you awake with intrigue, but to let the sheer, plodding vareness of history, the grain of it, the dust of it, lull you toward rest. The dry asides, the snarky footnotes about Habsburg jaws, they weren't punchlines, they were rhythmic devices, like the slow, even tick of a clock in a quiet room. So this now is the meta-script, the part where we acknowledge the artifice. You were listening to a constructed thing, designed to feel endless and circular like winter itself. The longest, quietest nights aren't defined by events, but by the space between them, the breath between sentences, the pause where a fact settles unchallenged into the mind before the next one comes. We talked about the cold that built ethics, that toppled thrones, that inspired art. But the final, quietest power of winter is simply this: it forces a pause in the narrative. In agrarian times, winter was the season when the story of the harvest was over and the story of the planting had not yet begun. It was the gap in the epic, the blank page between chapters. And in that gap, something happens, not in the history books, but in the people. The mind, deprived of outward momentum, turns inward. It reviews, it regrets, it dreams. It makes up stories about ghosts in the attic, or love letters never sent. It stares at the same patch of wall for an hour, and in doing so, perhaps sees it for the first time. This is what we've been doing, you and I, for these many thousands of words. We've been staring at the same patch of wall, the vast white wall of historical climate, and seeing the shapes emerge. The shape of a frozen army, the shape of a doomed king at his desk, the shape of a ship carrying a melting fortune. The script is done because the looking is done. The shapes have been pointed out. To continue would be to invent shapes that aren't there, to force a pattern where the only pattern is the beautiful, random, crystalline complexity of what already happened. So this is the true ending, not with a last story, but with the invitation to sit in the aftermath of stories. Imagine the room you are in, the temperature of it, the quality of the silence now that the voice has stopped. That silence is the same substance as the silence that fell on a frozen Moscow in 1812 after the last cannon groaned and the last retreating boot crunched into the snow. It's the same silence Philip II's study filled after the last dispatch was annotated. It's the same silence a Greenland Norse child heard, listening for a ship that would never come.
It's all the same silence. History is just the few things we've decided to say to fill it up. Now, let the silence return. It's older than all of us. It was here before the first winter, and it will be here after the last thaw. The video has been over for a while. The screen is dark. You've just been listening to the echo. Sleep well. Hey, still here? I suppose in the grand tradition of history, we can always find one more winter, one more pocket of cold where a few thousand humans shivered and tried to make a point. So let's drift.
one last time across the Atlantic to a place that doesn't usually do epic continent-spanning freezes, to Pennsylvania, to the winter of 1777-78, to a place called Valley Forge. Now, if you're an American, you've heard of this. It's a foundational myth, the crucible of the Revolution, the suffering that forged an army. If you're not, it's just another winter camp. But let's strip away the mythology and just look at the cold, wet facts. George Washington's Continental Army, after losing Philadelphia to the British, trudged into this winter encampment about 20 miles northwest of the city. They were not a professional force. They were farmers, tradesmen, idealists, and a lot of people who were just there because they'd signed up for a bonus and couldn't leave. They were poorly supplied, and I mean spectacularly poorly supplied. The Continental Congress, which was essentially a committee with a printing press for money, was broke and dysfunctional. Supply lines were a fantasy. So when winter set in, about 12,000 men tried to build a small city of log huts on a windy plateau. They were short on everything. Short on axes to cut wood, short on nails to build with, short on blankets, famously short on shoes. There are accounts of men wrapping their feet in rags, leaving bloody footprints in the snow as they walked guard duty. They called them, with grim understatement, the barefoot and naked soldiers. The winter wasn't even historically severe by the standards of what we've talked about. It was more of a persistent, damp, miserable cold, alternating between freezing rain and sleet, the kind of cold that gets into the bones and doesn't leave. Disease was the real killer. Typhoid, typhus, pneumonia, and dysentery swept through the crowded, unsanitary huts. By the end of the 6-month encampment, an estimated 2,000 men had died, not from British muskets, but from germs and exposure. They died quietly, in the mud and straw, while the British officers in Philadelphia were enjoying a relatively comfortable winter of balls and parties. The contrast is again almost too perfect. Now, where's the snark here? Where's the dry aside? It's in the management, because while Washington is remembered as the stoic, indefatigable leader, and he stayed with his men the entire time, the logistical failure was monumental. It was a systemic collapse, and Washington spent the winter writing increasingly furious, desperate letters to Congress, begging for supplies. He was, in effect, doing customer service for a starving army. Can you imagine the hold music? Just the sound of wind whistling through a chink in a log wall. And yet, this is where the story gets mythologized for a reason, because in the middle of this frozen quagmire, a strange, punctilious, and incredibly valuable man showed up. Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer with a somewhat inflated resume who offered to train the ragtag Continentals into a professional army. Picture this, a portly German who didn't speak great English, screaming drills through an interpreter at half-starved, frostbitten men. He started with a model company, teaching them how to march in step, how to handle their muskets in unison, how to move from a column into a fighting line without tripping over each other. It was basic, boot camp stuff, but it was exactly what they needed. He gave them a system, a routine, a sense of competence to replace the helplessness. The cold, in a way, was the container for this transformation. With campaigning impossible, there was nothing to do but drill or die. The hardship became a kind of brutal, shared focus. The army that emerged from Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 was not the same army that went in. It was leaner, harder, and it knew how to maneuver. They weren't just angry farmers anymore. They were soldiers who had survived a winter designed by a negligent government, and they were, understandably, pretty pissed off about it. That's a powerful motivator. So Valley Forge's winter wasn't about the cold defeating an army. It was about the cold making an army. It was a forced pause, a brutal timeout, where the very idea of the American army was stripped down to its raw components, cold, hungry men, and then slowly, painfully rebuilt into something that could actually win a war. It's a very human winter story, not about a kingdom falling, but about a collective stubbornness, about choosing to freeze in a field for an idea that was, at that moment, seeming pretty abstract and poorly managed. They stayed because Washington stayed, and Washington stayed because, well, he had nowhere else to go that wouldn't be total defeat. Sometimes leadership in winter isn't about grand speeches. It's about being the last one to leave the freezing room just so everyone else feels too guilty to go first. And with that, we really have covered the spectrum. We've seen cold end things, cold change things, and cold, in its most ironic twist, forge things. There are no more winters to visit. Not in this script. The historical record, of course, is endless. You could talk about the Great Frost of 1740, or the year of the summerless year, or the winter that froze the orange trees in Florida. But the point was never to catalog every chill. The point was the drift, the gentle, meandering journey through the quietest force in history. So we've reached the actual end. The final hut is built. The last bloody footprint has faded in the spring melt. The voice has nothing left to point at but the peaceful, empty field, greening under a sun that, at long last, feels warm. Thank you for listening, truly. Now, sleep. There is no grand history left. No kings shivering in palaces, no armies freezing in retreat, no pioneers trapped in mountain passes. We have walked through all those winters. We have felt their chill in the bones of the stories. This is what comes after. This is the quiet that follows the last anecdote, the stillness after the final footnote about failed logistics or misguided ambition. It is the gentle, empty space where the moral of the story, that there is often no moral, only cause and effect etched in ice, finally settles and ceases to matter. Imagine a field after a heavy snow, the kind that smooths over every furrow, fills every ditch, rounds every sharp edge. It is not a blank page, but a covered one. Everything that happened there, the growth, the harvest, the struggle, is still present, but silent, subsumed, at peace. That is where we are. The work of remembering is done. The work of explaining is done. The urge to weave one more ironic contrast between a king's velvet and a peasant's rags has dissipated, like breath on a cold window, fading from clearness back to plain, clear glass. You have been a patient listener. You have endured this long, simulated night. But the simulation is over. The program has run its course. All that is left is the soft hum of the machine and the weight of your own attention, now turning back inward toward your own room, your own breath, your own waiting dawn. There is a deep history to silence, too, deeper than the history of cold. It is the first condition and the last. It was here before the first winter wind, and it will be here after the last story about winter is forgotten. So let us not disrespect it by filling it with more words. Let the silence be the whole point. Let the waiting be the conclusion. Let the gentle release of the need for more be the final, merciful lesson of the cold. Goodbye.